I think we are going to give it one more minute as we have people coming in, and we'll kick it off. In the meantime, I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Maria Pousa. I'm the Chief Growth Officer at Digilant and ISPD, the holding group that owns Digilant. I've been working in advertising, technology, and media for the past 20 plus years. This is a topic dear to my heart. We are today going to be discussing how to election-proof your ads. And I have two wonderful guests with me as well. I'll introduce them in a moment. I simply wanted to do a housekeeping section as well. We are going to run for the next about 40 minutes, 45 minutes. We are going to leave the last 20 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes up for Q&A. As we go along, if you have questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat section, and we'll take care of answering those by the end. Today, what we have on the agenda is trends to share with you. We are also going to go over some of the top concerns and challenges that we typically see on election cycles, some of the opportunities that may also arise, and clearly cover your questions. So I have with me two wonderful experts. I wanted to introduce Heather Perkna, who is the VP of Sales for the entire East Coast and Southeast in the US. So Heather, if you want to do a quick intro also.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for letting us be a part of the webinar. Election season is a huge deal for digital advertising. So I think the common denominator amongst us is 20 years. I have, like Maria, been in digital advertising for 20 years. I did have a small stint as well in traditional, and working at companies like CBS, AOL prior to Digilant. I've been here for 10 years. As she mentioned, I manage the East Coast, and everything changes rapidly with digital. So we've seen a lot of changes over the last 20 years, and the biggest piece I think is the importance of data, which is never more important than during election season. It's super important to know your audience, so we'll unpack more of that later. So thanks for having me, Maria.
Thanks and welcome, Heather. And then we also have T.S. Kelly here with us, and he's Senior Accountability and Analytics Advisor. He's also supporting us at ISPD, but please, T.S., if you could introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I guess 20 years plus is the magic number here for all of us. I have the same thing. I've typically had measurement or analytics in my title. A good portion of my time I spent on the buy side, stops at Havas, Group M, and most recently I was the head of analytics for Cara inside Dentsu. And oddly enough, actually, I worked in local broadcast starting my career focused on performance of local TV and radio stations. So it's actually kind of that when we talk about elections, it's always been kind of extra special just from that standpoint. And no matter buy side, sell side, there's this extra intensity, heightened urgency on performance, especially localized performance when it comes to measurement. So I always think of that as, because I'm getting yelled at as a head of analytics when I, again, thinking about locals, that message impact is never enough and costs don't go far enough. And I'm glad we're having this conversation right now because I see that same level of cross-media intensity happening. Only difference, it used to happen, say, for a handful of months. I already think we're experiencing it right now. So we're already feeling the impact of November in all our marketing activities. So glad to be here.
Thank you, T.S. And one of the things that I didn't share was that I'm the former CMO of IAS as well, and also of MediaOcean. Particularly, I was at IAS during the 2016 election cycle, which really, I think it's tested me in many aspects as a marketer as well. Having to go through what became a particular season and a bit of a pivot and an inflection point in terms of how it impacts our world as well. But moving on, I will appreciate if everybody will indulge me. We have a little bit of a poll, and we wanted to engage you in the audience and see pretty much if we could take a guess as to how much media is e-marketing predicting that political advertisers are going to spend through this election cycle. We'll leave it running for a little bit.
Polls.
Can never escape them. Okay, we have a couple more coming in. We are seeing, okay, somewhere like we have most people are in the 12 billion bucket. Then we have like 40% on the 20 billion bucket, and we'll end the poll. So like, yes, you guessed correctly. They are pretty much anticipating that this year we are going to see another record-breaking year at 12 billion. There's even other like research that is expecting this number to go all the way up to 16 billion. But if you think from this perspective, this is a 3% of all the media that's going to be spent this year, which is a significant amount of budget, right? Being dedicated. And it's also compares to like if you wanna put it in context, in 2020, the spend was about like 9 billion for presidential election, 9.5. And then again, like for midterms, we saw it almost hit like the $10 billion number. But a lot of our customers are concerned about what this means with having this influx, particularly concentrated in a certain time period. TS, can you, in your experience, you have done quite a few of these as well. Can you give us a bit more context about how this media is going to be allocated?
Sure, we have a little bit of a timeline to show you in a moment, but we've already started seeing the political ads start surfacing multiple channels, multiple platforms, and a good portion of this is powered by super PACs and other nonprofits, other independents. If you're not familiar with a super PAC, that's the independent political action committees. They kind of came to prominence in the 2012 election cycle after the Citizens United decision from the Supreme Court in 2010. And there's a history lesson I could give you on that, but I'm not going to go into it. I'll bore myself. But this is really, that's where a lot of the spend we're seeing so far is powered, and it's just a prelude. So as we near the election, though, we're going to start seeing somewhat of an increase. So, think of September, October, into November, as we look at that chart, and particularly in the battleground states. And we could certainly define those here if you'd like, but I think we all know them. But a good 65, about 2/3 of spend will be in that little tight 3-month period. And this always seems to blow my mind. About 20% will be spent in those just handful of days in November leading up to. So again, election days on November 5th. So we think about 20% of all this spend going during that 5-day period. So I think it's important for all of us to recognize that there's going to be increased budgets, but also it's going to be a very crowded marketplace. And the one thing that I would also add as a wild card, lots of wild cards in 2024, is to look at the early voting dates by state and how they correspond to election cycles. So, and you might not think that, but some states start voting for the election in late September. That's Minnesota, South Dakota, Virginia, and another state where probably is already going to see the largest, most costly Senate race is Ohio, and they begin open early voting in the end of October. So don't think of election as just those first, those late weeks in October. This starts in September, and considering early voting, you really should pay attention to those months.
And what about digital spend, Heather? Like if the majority of political spend is going to hit that period of time, right? Like September through November, where is it going to be spent?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some interesting things happening when you look at political advertising. So while many industries and advertisers are moving more towards digital strategies, digital channels, political is one that's lagging behind. I mean, we've seen a huge pop in retail spend on digital. Same thing with retail, finance, CPG. Not the case for political, though. So in fact, when we go back to that $12 billion number that you mentioned from eMarketer previously, over $7 billion of that budget is going still towards linear broadcast, TV, traditional channels. So digital advertising right now will only see about 12% of that budget. And within digital, the majority of that is still going towards Google and Facebook. So, I think there's actually a tremendous amount of opportunity depending on, which verticals you may be in, which channels you're comfortable with. There's actually a lot of opportunity there.
Gotcha. And then TS, anything else that you want to add here as well?
Yeah, I think that's Heather hit it as there's huge opportunities on the digital side. One other, I had mentioned the super PAC spend, which in 2020, just to give you some context, it's not on the slides, was about just under 3 billion. So again, 2012 was about $1 billion. So 8 years later, 2020, the cycle, we saw super PAC and independence was about 3 billion. This year, I think that 12 billion number that you quoted, Maria, it's a safe bet if we see super PAC monies eclipse over 4. So as I said, I think the opportunities are going to see a very crowded marketplace, very much in linear, but to Heather's point, there's still going to be a lot of opportunity in digital, but the spend is going to be there. That 12 billion number is a safe bet.
Gotcha. And then we're gonna get into like the CPMs in a little bit, but one of the topics we wanted to address first was also like some of our clients, and we're hearing from colleagues and customers in market definitely concerned about the impact on supply and CPMs. They're also following up with us with the content, right? Related to the elections and the presidential election in particular, particularly as we get closer to November. And if we look back in time to the 2020 election, even during primary weeks, Twitter saw a 60% increase in election-related content. How is that going to play out this time around, and what's the role that X now is going to play on the elections? I think it's still to be seen. It will be interesting to see how people are how consumers are engaging with Twitter even during the Olympics period, given all the turmoil that is going on at the platform. So maybe we can get a little bit into the election fatigue and how it relates to content and how it relates to the work that we are doing here. So we're going to open up another poll and around what percentage of consumers were worn out by the amount of political discourse that they were seeing in 2020. And this one may vary by state as well. I think people in battleground states may be more fatigued than others. Okay, so let's see. So we have 55% leading the charge here. And then we have people guessing about 100%. I think it says a lot about how we're feeling or about to feel. And then we have people at 36% and no one for 20%. So I'm gonna wrap up the poll. And then again, I think you guys got it right. So pretty much 1 in 2 people, they
Smart
were
pollsters.
Yeah. Smart pollsters, the folks joining us today. But yeah, it's pretty much 1 in 2, right? They were pretty fatigued with the last election cycle. And there's 2 dynamics that may come up play with this when it comes to content. And one of it is that folks may be tired in general of seeing election content and seeing election ads running as well. They may regard, in particularly when we are in publishers, they may regard ads they see alongside election coverage in a negative light. Or there's the other side of this equation, and I think Heather has a lot to say here as well, around there may also be looking for things or ways to escape the content, and brands have the opportunity here to offer a positive distraction. And Heather, with this in mind, how can we help marketers navigate the election cycle? And what have you been advising clients?
Yeah, and I think you've brought up some really interesting points, because fatigue's at an all-time high, yet we couldn't be more addicted to devices right now. I even know people that go to detox spas for electronics for a week, right? So we can't get enough of the content. So I think a couple things that you mentioned, it could be a huge influx of content, huge influx of advertising. advertisers are working against consumers' personal feelings and emotions right now. This is a very, very polarized country at the moment. So I think brands have to be very careful with their messaging, of knowing when to protect their base, when to speak values, because, you had mentioned some of the social platforms earlier too. People are using TikTok right now as a search engine. People are getting mass amounts of information, not just from advertising, but self-produced content. And so, a couple different things. I think VRBO is a really great example. So you can look at certain types of verticals, certain types of messaging that are a huge contrast to the fatigue and the polarization experienced in political right now. VRBO is a very, it's rentals, it's beach vibes, it's ski vacations, it's calming, relaxing, peaceful content, very much a welcome distraction for most consumers during the election year. So if you're fortunate enough to have the type of brand and a really good marketing department that can put together some contrasting messages, that's one play that's very effective. And then, then you have the second bucket that I think is risky, but sometimes it's needed, where, consumers right now, a lot of the market really wants a company and a brand to speak to their values. So I think we all remember the fiasco with Budweiser.
Yeah.
Not the best example. That was a PR nightmare. But I also think if you do it right, and you consider with your messaging, rather than just sell a service or a product, are you also speaking to core values? But I mean, I think the underlying current with that is you have to really know your audience, and you have to be certain of your audience to do that effectively. So you have to pull in the analytics, the data, really know who you're speaking to, and make sure you're speaking to the right people, because I think the risk reward there could be tricky.
Yeah, and I when I was at IAS, we saw that happening, right? Like brands being dragged into the conversation, and I think everybody remembers this from like particularly the 2016 cycle with Kellogg's, Nordstrom. There were others, can't recall them now. Like you had like the Sleeping Giants movement within Twitter, were bringing the brands into the conversation as well, whether you liked it or not, and simply by like the choice of the media outlet you were running your campaigns against. So like, absolutely agree that being mindful of your messaging and understanding your audience, it's critical for this year. And then I just wanted to do like one thing, like before we even like get into the brand safety conversation, but TS, like if we stick for a second with consumers, and we are talking about like media spend in general and how that impacts the market, and we're gonna talk about like a little bit more later about pricing, but right, like all this influx of dollars coming in, advertising, how it will impact the advertising ecosystem. But what about consumers? I'm curious as to how the presidential elections are going to be impacting consumer spend, and what can we expect from the consumers we are trying to target, right, towards the end of the year, and what will that mean for the brands and for the advertisers in terms of the performance of their campaigns and how they may impact some of their expectations.
Okay, I'll pack that. It's a lot there, but I guess in typical measurement, person speak, I'll just say it depends. Unfortunately, it's like a yes and no answer. Is that you're right? Typically, we do see fluctuations in spend around the election event itself. So almost think of like people take hold your breath, what's going to happen? And there again, you think about 2020 versus 2019, we did see about a 6% drop in sales year over year. Again, historically, that's pretty much on par. And think about consumer sentiment for a second. That particularly the sentiment of those that are disappointed with the result. Again, that doesn't matter which party, but just we're disappointed. Sentiment, though, doesn't necessarily translate with that group into changes in activity. So specifically over long periods of time. There was a study that was done in 2015 by Princeton University and a few other organizations. And they looked at all the cycles from the past 20, 25 years. And there was that hold your breath moment. but then we proceeded. Now, mind you, 2024 is a bit, again, just like before, I mentioned before, there's wild cards, but there are some wild cards at play here. The economy is still seeing some level of inflation, particularly around CPG. Consumer sentiment is improving. University of Michigan, that's there, that's the gold standard. We look at that. We've improved significantly from a bit of a low in 2022, but we're still somewhat behind the high points we saw, say, during the Obama and Trump administrations. So that's in repair. And then also on the plus side, there is still a bit about stimulus money, COVID stimulus money lurking about that's propping up things. So all those things still happening. But in short, it's the don't panic moment. I do think you'll see a wait and see. We'll see a bit of a hold your breath moment, and then major purchases will happen just as before with cars and houses. So no, I don't expect there to be this dramatic change based on an event such as Election Day. I do think we're going to see just a return to norms regardless of who wins.
Gotcha. And that's important to also, right?
Yeah.
Like frame it and keep it in mind. And
don't make any drastic changes. You're right.
Correct. And I was going to ask you also, like, what does it mean from a media spend perspective as well, right? Because if you're like anticipating this dip, will you advise that you continue to run branded campaigns? Will you advise that the advertisers, they continue to run programs, or what's your take on that one?
Well, absolutely. Again, I think Heather and I can both answer that question, just considering our, historical experiences during this period. Is that just a few weeks later, the holiday season's coming up, so there's a lot of attention that will shift away, and almost some people want to think about other things and get back to the normal day to day. So I do think brand messaging should still be, as I said, not panic and start pulling budgets out. I do think that we're going to have a lot shorter window, especially because of the election cycle. So spend, I would not necessarily, this is going to be a gangbuster year when it comes to spend, but it's certainly a higher concentration of spend in a shorter period of time. But I don't expect budgets to be cut dramatically.
Gotcha. Okay. So moving on, before we move on, Heather, anything else you want to add? Or otherwise we'll go into run safety.
Yeah. I mean, actually, I would add one thing. I mean, I think it goes back to really knowing your base and to make sure that you're aware, yet you're not alarmed, right? So the landscape is a little bit different in election season. You have to be a little bit smarter to make sure that you're a good steward with your clients' money and your brand's money. But I think there's always opportunity, right? So like a good example of that is while there is polarization, while there is some fear, while there is some of the things that TS mentioned earlier as well, where there are certain dips in sales for holiday, there's other opportunity for other types of brands. So normally in an election year, you see interest rates drop, and those have been so high. As we start to see those come down towards the end of the year, there's going to be more home buyers in the market. People are going to be purchasing homes. If you are, a retailer that sells inside of like a Home Depot, a Lowe's, certain retail, certain CPG, I actually think there's a huge opportunity, especially on platforms that do not allow political advertising, as well as some of the ones that political is not eating up the inventory and driving up the cost, like CTV, like audio, a couple others. So opportunity and risk, there's always both.
Always. And talking about opportunity and risk, we're going to move on to run safety, right? And it's interesting for me. I work at AOL back in the day also, like Heather. And I remember when brand safety became this thing within the organization, I was working there. And this is a period of time where Britney Spears had her unfortunate mental health episode, right? And she was a spokesperson for Pepsi, if people remember, back then. And AOL used to own, I don't think they don't do that anymore, or they don't own them anymore, but they used to own TMC. So TMC was running all this negative coverage about what's happening with Britney while running all those Pepsi ads next to those articles. And we lost the customer. I remember I was there, and for a while, AOL couldn't recover the Pepsi account. And over the years, right, people started talking about brand safety, but brand safety became much more associated about the obvious and almost naive things of like, okay, don't run, if you're a CPG company or a pharma company, do not run like your ads. I don't want to run my ads on an article that is, right, like talking about a recall or a recall of my products, or if there was a plane crash, airlines that don't want to run their ads next to those articles as well. But when one of the things that we saw in 2016 was this pivot moment. And then it became much more about like your content being associated and like potentially be perceived by consumers as endorsing a candidate or the other, or endorsing a political ideology or another. And in fact, about like 82% of marketers are quite concerned about like on executives about the, marketing during the US presidential election cycle. And this is something that started much more around like the year 2016. And it becomes, like we were saying before, right, like a reflection of the polarization of our society. So most brands, they want to avoid being dragged into the conversation, and we are, right, like our job is here like to sell products primarily, and then there's other questions around values, principles, ESG even, etc. But every brand, because of that, will have like different tolerance levels of running next to any kind of political related content. So Heather, when you're discussing brand safety with customers, what are some of the strategies that are coming up on your end, and what are some of the things they could be implementing?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there are two buckets. There are the things that you can control, and there are the things that you can't control. So, with TikTok, you have 41% of consumers using it as a search engine right now, 64% of Gen Z. Can't control that. You have AI, that's a big fear. A lot of fake news and content out there that's not valid. You can't control that. What you can control are some of their parameters you're putting around your brand safety. So for instance, enlisting, making sure that you're working with a partner. This is such a fragmented space, whether it's, your internal teams, partners that you use, making sure that they have brand safety partner tools intact throughout the duration of your campaign, making sure that you are, proactive with negatively targeting unsafe environments, unsafe keywords, utilizing your block lists. And then another thing is, to consider premium ad buys. So to make sure you are 100% in control of where your messaging is and who sees it. And that again goes back to also understanding your audience and making sure you're putting it in front of the right people at the right time.
Yeah, and I think like something that I recall also from my former days is around, if you're negatively targeting as well, please remember to remove those negative keywords when the period of, let's call it, crisis has happened. We have seen a lot of times continue to run those negative keywords for long periods of times and missing out on opportunities to show up next to suitable content, right? And then, T.S., from your perspective, anything else that you want to add on how to combat as well? Concerns over misinformation, brand safety, like you mentioned, Heather, like we live in the age of Mid-Journey, OpenAI, and DALL-E as well. It's sometimes difficult to even know what's real anymore. I don't know if anybody saw from Met Gala yesterday, like the Katy Perry. She did not attend. She was wonderfully dressed, but it was an AI-generated image, and a lot of people have been very confused. Myself too, actually, like if she was there or not, and she was not there.
And usually in passing, a lot of the content, there's going to be the light images that people see that they don't realize aren't real. That in a passing view could be considered legitimate, or at least passing as legitimate. So these are obviously challenging times. I was going to mention before I go into the tools that are on the screen and some suggestions that there is an organization that is non-affiliated, works closely with the buy-side, sell-side, direct brands called the Brand Safety Institute. And collectively, industry colleague Lewis Jones is their CMO, the shout out to him. But this is, that organization just bangs this, the drumbeat of this. And I think many folks that are on this call, you might not realize, but your organization is very likely already a member. So I would suggest checking those folks out, or if you're not members, it'd be something to consider. But even with not being membership, there's some good protocol tests and certifications that even some of our less experienced members of the industry can take a look at. So just again, that's more of an editorial, pardon me, Maria, but jumping into the tools of the trade, there are going to be various platforms that are, they're banning or blocking the political discourse, not discourse per se, but that spend, be it TikTok, Xandr, Netflix. So there are those that are restricting those ads, and then there are others that are establishing, on the right, safety protocols, which is great. However, considering recent history, in some cases, some of these platforms on the screen, nothing is fail-safe. Perfection is the enemy of good. This is where you can't just let something run and just not observe it. If a PR team is involved already, it's too late. So there's going to be measures in place, and and I come from the youngest of 8 children. I've always learned from my other older siblings' mistakes, if you will. Not that you want to see brands have trouble, but other brands have had challenges, as we've mentioned, Budweiser and a few others. Learn from those, and there's the motivation by these organizations is to prioritize brand safety. I mean, that's what they talk about. So in the coming months, we have the opportunity to not just wait for a mistake, but learn from the insights that we see on these platforms.
Gotcha. 8, you're one of 8?
Yes, I'm the youngest.
Yes.
Always had to pick my spots. So but I learned from their mistakes. I made new mistakes. That's but I would just say proceed with caution. But yeah, I was youngest, so
lots of lessons there.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm gonna hear stories about that later. So Heather, we're gonna move on and the last 10 minutes and cover also and talk a little bit about CPMs and if we can go to the next one, Tim. But you mentioned premium advice, right? And this is one of the biggest concerns that we have been hearing about is rising costs, rising CPMs. And while linear will be one of the most crowded channels also for political advertisers, digital is still projected to see an increasing cost. In fact, Forrester predicts it's going to be around 13% towards the end of the year. So with this expectation, what can advertisers do to combat rising CPMs? And I'm open this up for both of you, Heather and TS.
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in. So, I think we touched on this earlier as well. It's important to first look at some channels that are not going to be as impacted by political ad spend. So digital audio, digital out of home, advanced TV. Some of the social sites that were not on those lists that you showed earlier are actually some of the ones that were, because they're not allowing political advertising of any form. So, I think CTV and audio, for example, you have podcast ads. A lot of our clients are buying very, very, very contextually relevant ad placements where political wouldn't even touch this. So, it's very much a matter of supply and demand. I think first you look at the places where you have supply, but you're not having a ton of demand from all the influx of political dollars that are coming in. So that's going to keep your CPMs low right from the jump.
What about you, TS?
Well, again, starting my career in local, I kind of always think about that, especially during election cycles, because it's just political is highly localized and extremely audience specific. So that also plays a huge part in CPM. So depending on the brand partner, depending on the audience, you may see huge increases. Heather did mention, again, this is going to be one of those, pick your channels and pick your targets, but we could see massive increases or none at all. So for example, you look at, say, some of the battleground states like Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, you could see connected TV CPMs the end of October, early November, over $100. So, but in Texas, where, depending on your point of view, depending on local, national, we've got, clients clearing at $35. So it really depends. And I mentioned this thing wild card earlier. Ohio is a huge wild card this year. The Senate race is a lot of money in that race. So markets where we didn't necessarily think were going to be in play, Connecticut, Columbus, Cincinnati, Cleveland, just keep an eye on those rates. And if you live there, keep an eye, as I said, the election dates, early voting, et cetera, because these cost periods are going to come up rather quickly. So I always think of this almost in every 4 years, we're like in a double upfront and not just an upfront, because if you can mitigate some of the risk by buying upfront, yes, you're paying a premium, but you'll have a little bit more of a cost control later on, because I do think spot rates and bump rates are going to be quite expensive over the coming months, especially the scatter market's always expensive typically, but in the latter part of this election cycle, it's going to be brutal.
So negotiating fixed rates, taking advantage of if you can geo target and maybe moving money to the least expensive or not battleground states. I take those two. And then what about channels, Heather, also?
Yeah, I mean, again, digital out of home, CTV, audio, social, political is typically not involved in that as much. So that not only keeps the CPMs down, and I really want to stress here, it is not a matter of low cost and low quality. It's tremendous quality. The amount of measurement that you can get, the amount of targeting, it's just, and I think all three of us have worked in traditional, the whole nightmare of, you can have secured inventory on a TV show or on, a radio broadcast, but the next show is going to start at a certain amount of time. And if another advertiser comes in and they're willing to pay more money, you get bumped. So
don't buy bumpable rates.
What is it? Technical difficulties. I have heard that before.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I think, exploring digital channels, it's not only going to keep some of the CPM costs down, but you also don't have to worry about having to change at the last minute with bumps and things like that. You can plan a little bit further in advance. You hopefully have those costs down, and you can also go towards very, very contextually relevant audiences, which also helps with the brand safety concerns as well.
Absolutely. So because we are at we have 20 minutes left. We have one more question that I think to wrap it up, also how we cannot talk about measurement. And I think TS, you're here, our superstar from a measurement and analytics perspective, right? So any advice on tools and strategies that could be deployed? Is there anything that we could be doing differently? Anything that maybe we should be paying attention to?
Again, everyone likes to talk about AI. I want to kind of not use that term loosely, other than just to say that if it's AI influenced or not, everything is just going faster. So, start with the suggested measurement tactics that you see on the screen. These are about the table stakes, just doing things well during this period. You're going to have to keep an eye on performance doubly so, because of the things that Heather mentioned. Just from a channel perspective, cost opportunities may exist quickly, but you want to jump on them before others have. So to me, it's about going faster. I am obviously very focused on what AI means when it comes to tools, data, et cetera, but just kind of keeping this simple to creative. There's multivariate testing that's possible, A/B testing. I would actually use the opportunity, like Heather mentioned, maybe doing some non-battleground market testing. Think of markets where are still important. Maybe they're secondary priorities, but you could do the testing in those secondary priorities and maybe shave some cost off. So that also plays a part in how you use geos and how you are able to do brand safety analysis in these areas. Again, I'm going to say, I was taking notes with Heather because I think of digital out of home and connected TV and the other areas where perhaps aren't as focused on political, create opportunities in very safe ways to focus on those. And then I'll finally talk about testing, is that there is this ability to use, and this is going more like the lab coat and into the analytics team thinking that synthetic sources of data are becoming much more popular in their use. And what that means is that you're creating almost like a test environment before you implement. And if you're a data scientist, you work with an analytics team, they can do agent-based models even before campaigns are launched. And I see that because of speed, because of all these different types of machine learning / AI capabilities, testing becomes something that can be so much more in campaign than just, just post-campaign or pre-campaign. So there's a lot of opportunities pre, during, as well as post, all layered on speed, all layered on, if it's AI or AI light, opportunities for you to influence cost, audience, as well as targetability right now.
Perfect. So like, and thanks, I really like your A/B testing suggestions. They are particularly TS. And I want to wrap it up. We have like the last 15 minutes. We have some questions that we have received as well. And I don't know if anybody has any other questions on the audience, and please feel free to drop them in the chat. We also received questions from the registration time. Let me see. One that I wanted to cover was that we got at the registration was, I have some retail clients who are worried about the overlap in timing of the election and the holiday shopping season, especially the increasing cost. What recommendations do you have for campaign planning and navigating rising costs alongside the need to advertise in late October, early November? And we covered this a little bit before, but I don't know if like TS or Heather, you want to?
I mean, again, I mentioned earlier, just as far as the window of time, there's a concentration factor. So again, I'll just talk about localize. I am more concerned about not having clearances available in, say, November, late November and into December versus just cost. So if it's an upfront opportunity, maybe you're paying a premium. I would not be buying anything bumpable for the next several months for that period. So that to me is where I think retail clients are going to be, focused. I do think you should not be panicking about this election cycle. Maybe it's not going to be gangbusters, but I do think it's going to be a strong holiday season. So stay the course.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I would add one thing that we haven't really mentioned, because we mentioned the channels, right? There's certain channels that you can look at that are innately less expensive. Look at where supply and demand are. I think another thing that you can look at is, really figure out what is a nice to have with targeting versus what is essential, because the more targeting layers and the more extras that you add on to your channel buys, that's also going to drive your cost up. So if you really look and you try to protect your base, this might not necessarily during those months when certain places are higher with CPMs or traditional costs, whatnot, might not be the time to try to rapidly expand and go after a new audience, but maybe it is the time to make sure you're securing the base and that you're really only utilizing the targeting tactics that are essential to keep those costs lower.
Yeah. If I would just add one other thing, that was great. Just if any of our folks focused on retail are utilizing MMM, I would not be projecting huge performance, ROAS beyond perhaps your average for this year, just considering all the variables. But just, that means you have to think about what can you do with the same budget, and perform as best as possible versus spending, and then again, spending more, but still being able to achieve the ROAS that you might have seen in previous cycles. So I just, as I said, I play sometimes the victim of shoot the messenger when it comes to performance. So again, I always think of these cycles where sometimes we don't see the types of performance or margins that we expected, and many times it's cost, delivery, all the different culprits. But it's going to be a tighter window. And as I said, don't shoot the messenger when it comes to analytics, folks. I just ask you that.
We have another question that is, in your experience, is linear TV the only channel that preempts brands for political spending? Or does that happen on digital channels as well?
I don't know, Heather, if you want to answer that, you actually kind of answered that before. I just said, just the opportunity of the ground less, you think of the areas where you don't see as much political spend, are there opportunities there, especially locally? If that answers that question.
Yeah, and I think that's partly answering that question, then also partly going a little bit beyond. I think that when you have a market that has more advertising than a normal period, in addition to looking at the CPM costs and some of those things, in contrast with like linear versus others, it's also an inventory issue, right? So inventory doesn't affect just the cost, but inventory also affects, are you in the right place at the right time, speaking to the right folks? And the one thing with some of the digital opportunities that you might have is simply, there's no limit of inventory. So if one source is tapped out, you can absolutely look at other places. So, I think sometimes with linear, what you might experience is a stop, whereas in some of these other channels, it may just be a pivot. So it may be, okay, not right here, but this is equally as good. We can change really quick, going to that fast that TS was talking about, making quick decisions, yet also making sure they're smart decisions is key right now.
Yeah, it's actually really important. I mean, I was just that made me think of something else, Heather, is that, you think of just a lot of the automated, real-time buying that takes place on a lot of the platforms that we all, utilize, is that there likely will be some inflation risks in various channels. But to me, overall, I think it's just, again, you mitigate that by keeping an eye on it. You're not necessarily spending and fire and forget. You're looking at these systems. And that's another reason why testing is so important, and just utilizing that spread, looking at other avenues to reach that same audience. So it's all hands on deck for that period, for sure.
Talking about the testing, DS, have you seen examples of or success of people doing ABA testing across different DMAs? And
oh my goodness, yes. I mean, that's, yeah.
But meaning more about like during the presidential cycles, or like, I'm just, wondering, like, have we seen brands testing like messaging that lean more towards one side of the aisle or the other? And if there's risk implied in that as well.
Well,
right?
I mean, again, I think of this as that I do think there is this ability, this need, and you do see it. I've done studies, in the past, looking specifically at where, it might not be channel specific, it might be program specific, where you see brands avoiding risk, just, contextually based on topics, things of that nature. So that happens. Again, news tends to be that area of kind of rocky shoals that you need to somewhat avoid or cherry pick a bit, like keeping to more general news and more opinion shows, things of that nature. I see that happen all the time. And then, I mean, that can impact, as even Heather mentioned, you think about the fact that you might not necessarily get the reach or delivery of your audience segment via digitally. There are opportunities to avoid that by trying, connected TV, trying, other channels to reach that same audience. So from a testing perspective, we've done this in many different environments, but I do see more about the planning and buying protocols in place to mitigate risk during not just an election cycle, but in general, from a brand safety perspective. Testing, typically, I would say that that's where you have opportunity to look at all the alternate channels to deliver those audiences, as Heather suggested. I was just thinking initially when you said A/B testing that you could do match market testing, where you keep one market out of that circulation of doing this and just do steady as just keep to normal business practices in that market. You don't have to necessarily change all markets. You obviously want to still protect revenue and performance in that market, but you could maybe just have a pull out, just a call out market where you hold out, where you're doing specific testing and everything else being the same. So there are a lot of different ways that you can approach a testing scheme, a learning plan that doesn't, that mitigates risk and also puts you in an opportunity to still perform without, as I said, spending. Because again, as a research person, again, I'm loquacious here, you tend to want to be able to still hit your numbers and test. And this type of situation, you can do both.
Gotcha. And then we have 7 more minutes. So if anybody else has any other questions, then we have one more. This is an interesting one, because do you see AI having an impact or a big impact on the election this year? From my experience, we'll answer that what happened in 2016, we were dealing with fake news. We were also dealing with malware, collecting brand dollars and being funneled into certain Russian cells. So my guess is yes. I will see that like we will definitely see that like it's gonna have an impact on the election cycle this year.
Well,
I don't know,
that's why brand
TS.
safety is so important.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
I was just going to say that, I mean, we've already seen a couple of instances where we've seen bad actors doing things, not necessarily in the large channels, but just being able to, I guess you just call it share of noise. I don't know what else to call it. I may have just made that up, but just, that there's always bad actors that are trying to put as much garbage into the system. The things that Heather mentioned, myself as well, that there are ways to mitigate the risk and to avoid that share of noise, if you will. So I do think AI is playing a part in that noise, but there are things that we've discussed during this call to avoid it.
Yeah, and I would actually add one more thing to that too, because I think right now, everyone has a different spectrum of comfort with AI right now. So you have some people that are like, oh, wow, this is the most efficient thing. It's going to be tremendously helpful. Then you have the other side of the spectrum that's like, okay, we're about to enter Terminator 3 right now. Like, what's going on here? So, the noise and some of the things that we talked about are some of the challenges with AI. But I also think that there are some opportunities with AI for marketers that use it in a very smart way. So, for instance, if you're really deep in the analytics and nuances between your audience in these states versus this state, or just nuances in general, you can really create some cool custom things within your creatives where maybe you're just switching one tiny component here and there. So, I think that it's a mixed bag. I think that there's some concern and some challenges, but then I also think there's some really cool, efficient plays that you could utilize. You just have to be really careful with your timing. And if you're not really advanced with AI right now, this is probably not the time to test that. But if you have experience and you can use it in an intelligent way, it might be awesome. So
absolutely. So I think we have like a final slide with like 3 quick things that we want you guys to take away, or we want everybody to take away from the session. 1, we have heard it, remain steady and protect your base. Like Heather was just saying that maybe like towards the end of the year, or as we get close to the election, the presidential election in particular, maybe it's not the time to go crazy with your strategy and your tactics, and really it's the time to double down on the things that like you feel comfortable with, that like you're aware of, that and you have a better chance to control. And I don't know if Heather or TS want to add anything there.
I don't want to sound like a broken record. You could test in some non-sensitive markets. I just don't think there's opportunities to test, I'd say, secondarily. But to me, this is about, I think you said about protecting your base, kind of answers what number 2 should be.
Correct. Which is
I'm always a tester.
Testing, yes. But you should start, our advice is that you start testing your creative now. Start testing your audiences now, and do not wait towards later. And as we get close to the deadline, this will help you prepare to be like protect your base and have a better sense of what are the things that are performing, and help you also avoid some potential landmines or challenges. And then have a crisis communications protocol in place. Be prepared to act quickly. Sometimes you may check everything in your checklist and you may still be dragged into the conversation. This is beyond our industry, right? Like this is what defines, what will define like in which way our society goes. So you may be dragged into the conversation, whether you like it or not. So like be prepared to react if that happens on social media. Be prepared to work with your like PR teams, or if you have like communications teams in-house, have a protocol in place as well on how to handle this and be able to react swiftly. Anything else, guys, before we close it out?
Everything's moving just so much faster today. Yeah. So thank you. That to me is the only one that faster means opportunity as well as keeping your eye on mitigating risk.
Yeah, and I mean the last thing that I would add is just to simply, again, hammering down, be aware, but don't be alarmed. So even going back to this first point on here with remaining steady and protecting your base, and going with what works, that's really your knowledge on the audience, what values they have, what they're listening to. You can still move into other channels to make sure you're keeping the costs down and doing different things, but this isn't probably the time to test out a brand new audience that you've been working with, right? But I think the different channels and different tactics, you actually have to be a little bit more nimble with those things.
So Heather, T.S., thank you so much for joining me today, and thanks for everybody in the audience for joining us. We are going to follow up and send the recording of this webinar so you can have it handy. And any other further questions, like please feel free to reach out to us and we'll help you. So everybody, thanks on behalf of the Digilant team, and goodbye.